Alright then, so it's time to start to create this first component, and that is going to be a tooltip. Now, first of all, I've created the HTML for this. Very simple. We have a container first, and all of our content is ultimately going to go inside this container. And up here we have a couple of styles. We have a body style where the font size is 1.5 ems just to make it a bit bigger. Then we have this container class that has a margin of 40 pixels all the way around, but a margin top of 60 pixels. So that's this container that is going to surround everything. Okay, so the tooltip itself, I've just created a p tag with a load of text in. Then we've surrounded this part of the text inside a span. And that span has a class of tooltip. So ultimately, when we hover over this section in the browser, that is when we're going to see the tooltip. Now, what message do we display to the tooltip? Well, we add that to a data message attribute onto the span tag. And this is going to be the text that is seen inside that tooltip when we hover over this text. So that is the HTML sorted. Now, the next thing I've done is already create a tooltip.js file inside Ninja UI. So inside this, what we're going to do now is create the JavaScript for our tooltip component. Now in this chapter, what I'd like to do is try to bring together a lot of the different things that we've learned in this entire course. So I'm going to use classes, arrow functions, and all that jazz. And what we'll do for each component is create a class. So we'll create a class for the tooltip component. And inside this class, we're going to define a constructor which takes in an element as a parameter. So this element is the thing that we want to use the tooltip on. So in our case, it's going to be, if we look inside the index, this span tag way over here. This is the element that we're using the tooltip on. So that's what we're going to pass in there later on when we create a tooltip instance. So inside, I'm going to say this.element is equal to the element that we take in. And then I want to say this.message, which is the thing we're going to show inside the tooltip, is equal to the elements that we take in. Then we want to get the attribute, and that attribute we want to get is the data hyphen message. Remember, that was the attribute that we added right here. So we're going to get that message from the element that we pass in, and we're going to store it on this property, this.message, inside the class instance. And that's all we need to define in the constructor. They're the only two things we really need. Now, inside each of our classes for each different component, we're going to have probably an init function. And we're going to call this function to initialize our component. So inside this, what do we want to do? Well, first of all, we want to create some kind of element, which is going to be that little bubble. And I'm going to call this the tip. So let's say const tip is equal to documents.create element. And the element we want to create is going to be a div tag. So this div tag is going to be the little bubble itself, the tooltip, that when we hover over, we see. Okay, so this is going to have a class of tip. So we need to add that class. So we'll take the tip constant we just created, then say class list, and then use the add method. And inside the add method, we want to add the class of tip. So, oops, that needs to be inside quotations, tip. Okay, so the next thing we want to do is set the text content of this div right here as well. Now the text content is just going to be this thing right here, this.message. So let me say now tip.text content is equal to this.message. So now we have this div element, we've given it a class of tip so we can style it later, and we've applied this text to it. So the stuff that we pass into data message. So now we have that element ready. Now we want to append it to the DOM, but where do we want to append it to? Well, what I'm going to do is append it to the actual span tag right here inside it. So we know to do that, we can use the method append or append child. So I'm going to now say this.element, which is the span tag, then use the method append child, and I'm going to pass in the tip. Okay, so now we're appending this to the DOM. So if I save this, what I'm going to do is go into index.js first of all, and I want to import this tooltip class into index.js. But before we do that, remember, we have to export it from over here. So at the bottom, let's now say export, and we're going to say tooltip as default. So we're exporting this as the default value in this file. So now we've exported it, we can come over to the index.js and we can import that. So I'm going to say import we'll call it tooltip like this, the same as what we called it inside the class, from, and then it's going to be dot / ninja -UI to go into the Ninja UI folder from where we are, / from the tooltip.js file, but we don't need to write .js. Webpack is clever enough to figure out we're importing JS. Okay, so now we've imported that, we can go ahead and actually create a tooltip. And the way we do that is by saying const tooltip is equal to document.querySelector, and what we're doing here is querying for the element that we're ultimately going to pass in to this constructor. And that element is going to be, if we can open up our index, the span over here with a class of tooltip. So we need to grab that element in order to pass it into the class constructor. So we're going to grab that by saying that we want the tooltip class like so. So now we have that, we can say new tooltip and pass in this thing right here. So that is now stored inside tooltip, and that is our instance of the tooltip class, and we're passing in this element right here. So it's taking that into the constructor, setting this up, and now we need to call the init method on this class. So let us now do that. I'm going to come down here and say tooltip.init and call this. So if I save this now and then come over to the browser, looks like we have an error. And it said cannot get attribute of null. Maybe we just need to refresh the page for this to work. No, we still get the error. So it says cannot get attribute of null. So the only place we use get attribute is inside the tooltip itself, and that is over here, get attribute, and we get it from the element, and the element itself we're passing in from over here, so document.querySelector, and we're getting the tooltip class. So let me just make sure in the index file that this actually has, oops, nope, okay, that's why. So it's tootlip and not tooltip. So now let me save this and I'll refresh over here. Now we shouldn't get that error if we refresh, and we can see now this thing, I'm a tooltip. This is the stuff that we're outputting to the DOM. So this is the first step done, but this thing right here, first of all, we need to style it differently, but also we only actually want to show it when we hover over the thing inside the span tag. So that's this text right here. So when we hover over this, then we want to show this, but when we hover away, then we want to hide it. Now to do that, we could just use a class. So when we hover over this, it applies a class of active to this. When we go away, it takes that active class off, or something like that. So let's go back to our tooltip.js class and do this. So the next thing I'm going to do inside this init method right here is set up these event listeners. So I'm going to say, first of all, this .element to get the element, the span tag, .add event listener, and we're going to listen for an event called mouse enter. Now mouse enter fires when we enter the element. Okay, it just fires once when we enter it. While we're hovering inside it, it doesn't fire again and again, just once as we enter it. So we'll fire a callback function when this happens. We don't need the event object inside, but inside what I'm going to do is take the tip which we created, that new element that we appended to the DOM, and I'm going to say .ClassList, and we want to add a class of active at this point. So when it has a class of active, then we'll show it. And that happens when we have a mouse enter event on the span, when we hover over it. Now we also want to do the opposite, so that when we get a mouse exit or mouse leave, it's called, then we take that class away. So let me say now this .element, which is the span tag again, .add event listener. This time the event is going to be the mouse leave event. So when we go away from the span tag, then we want to take this class off the tip. So we'll do a function, and inside that function we'll say tip.classList, and then remove, and that is going to remove the active class. So let me just demo this. So watch this thing right here. I'm going to inspect this element so we can see this div. Now when I hover over this right here, you can see the class of active over there. When I hover away, it goes. So now we can use this class to show and hide this div. So the next step then is to just do the CSS for this component. So let me save this, and now I'm going to create a new file inside styles, and this is going to be called tooltip.css. So rather than me write this CSS out from scratch, because I know this is not a CSS course, I'm going to just copy this from my repo and paste it in, and I'm going to explain it. So first of all, the tooltip itself, that is the span tag, the thing that surrounds it all over here. So this we're saying has a position of relative, and we're doing that because we're going to position this inside it using position absolute. So it has that position of relative. We're displaying it as inline block and giving it this color. So the text is going to be different. So we know that we can hover over it. Then we're giving it a border bottom, which is dotted and this color as well. And we're also giving it this help cursor when we hover over it. So the tip itself, which is the element we create over here, this div, that is the thing with the text in that's going to show when we hover over something. That is going to have a visibility of hidden to begin with, so we're not going to see it on the page. It's also going to have a width of 150 pixels. This background color, which is the same as the text, I've just changed that accidentally, so let me just undo. But this is the same color as the text up here. And then we have a text color of white. With text aligned center, border radius of 10 pixels, so we get those corner edges. Then we have a padding of 5 pixels. Position is absolute, which means we're positioning it absolutely relative to this tooltip. And then what we're doing is saying from the bottom, it's going to be 120 pixels. So we're pushing it up a little bit so it appears above the text itself, this text inside the span. Then from the left, we're going in 50 pixels, so we're starting in the middle. And then the margin left is minus 75 pixels, which is half of the width. This basically all means that the tooltip is going to be centralized above the text, and the opacity is 0 to begin with. We're going to transition the opacity over 0.3 seconds so that when it's active down here, the opacity is transitioning, so it's a softer transition to 1, so it's fully visible at this point, and we also have a visibility property of visible. Now then, this thing down here, tip after, this is a pseudo class that is allowing us to enter some content after this element. The content is empty, and all we're doing is using this rule to add a little triangle at the bottom of the tooltip message. So again, this is going to be position absolute, 100% from the top, so it's going to be at the bottom of the tooltip bubble. Then it's going to be left 50%, so it moves it to the middle. Then the margin left is minus 4 pixels. Now the border width is going to be 4 pixels, and that's why we do a margin left, so we're scooting it back the border width. Then we're giving this a border style of solid, transparent, and this color right here. So basically this is going to make a little triangle at the bottom of the bubble. This is a little CSS trick. So if I save this now and come back over here, in fact we need to import this CSS, remember, so let's go to tooltip over here, and then at the top we need to say import, and we want to go into the styles folder, so // to say this directory, then styles, then we want the tooltip.css file. So let me save this now and preview, and we can see this is a different color. We don't see the tooltip text by default on the page, but when we hover over this now we can see that tooltip because of those event listeners we set up that's applying this class of active and taking it away when we hover and move out again. So there we go, my friends. That is the first component that we've created. So that's all living inside Ninja UI, right? So if we need to use that in our application, all we're doing is importing that class right here from the tooltip component. Then we're creating a constant, which is a new instance of that tooltip class. We pass in the elements that we want to use this on, and then we initialize it. And then that's all we need to do from our index file. So the ultimate end goal here is that at the end of everything, we have this Ninja UI folder that we can just import into our projects inside the source folder. Then when we're writing our JavaScript, if we want one of those features, all we have to do is something like this. That's pretty simple to do, right? So anyway, that's the first component done now. And in the next video, we're going to move on and look at the second component, drop downs.